All right, so we're going to talk about how to plant trees, and there are lots of ideas out there about how to do that. But we're going to try to stick to the best practices. I should say I'm a certified arborist, and I have about 20 years experience planting trees in all sorts of different conditions. That's this perspective I come from, and there are always other perspectives that are also valuable. What we'll be covering today specifically is things to consider before you plant, how to understand utilities, right tree, right place, which we're not going to dive in too much, but it's worth noting, types of plant material, get down in the dirt with planting, like actual how to plant a tree, what you should be doing when in that moment when you have the tree, you have the soil, and you want to get the tree in the soil. And then the after planting care. So I like to kind of put a little bit of a push out there that trees are part of the landscape that we live in, and trees have significance. And while this image that I'm showing you of the How We Got Here video that the city of Tacoma put together doesn't specifically talk about trees, it does talk about the landscape of the city of Tacoma. So invite you to take a look at that sometime and see if you discover something, learn something that maybe helps you think about how our city has been shaped. And so where are you planting trees? It's really the first thing is, do you actually have a place to put a tree? Sometimes, well, I don't have a picture of it, but you'll see sometimes a tree right up against a house. And while that tree is really awesome, it might not be the best place for the tree. So there are lots of conditions in which it may or not be the best place to plant a tree. So the first thing to do really before you buy the plant or get the plant is to take a look around and see what the space looks like, or really thinking about the fact that trees get older, they get bigger, what's going to happen as that tree gets older or bigger. Do you have utilities? How close are you to a stop sign? Do you have power lines overhead? Do you have a roof line overhead? Things like that. How do you use the space, or how is the space used? These are all important considerations when considering planting, because they will really shape what kind of tree you can or want to plant. I also wanted to note I feel some responsibility here to share that the city does regulate some of the ways that trees can be planted in the right-of-way specifically. So there are some codes that you can take a look at. I will include these in that email that I mentioned that will go out tomorrow. That really regulate just basically how and what you can plant along the right-of-way. If you're talking about private property, it's a little bit different story. The city also has a tree planting permit. Again, that's for the right-of-way. And since we're kind of in the season for grit city trees, you might be receiving a right-of-way permit. And so, I'm not a right-of-way permit, you might be receiving a tree for the right-of-way. So it's good to know kind of what's expected. In the case of grit city trees, they will handle the permit. But if you see your neighbor planting a tree in the right-of-way and you're like, yeah, that's a great idea, you may need to get a permit for that. It's free and relatively easy if you do it online. The other thing to consider is how are cars fitting into this space? There are sometimes interactions between cars and trees. So you would just want to see, is somebody using the right-of-way to park their car? And if so, can you really take the car out of the picture to make space for that tree, or are you going to try to find a way to kind of have those two coexist? Now that really relates more to the right-of-way, but something to consider if you're thinking about planting a tree next to a driveway. Sidewalks are also another issue, or not issue, they're something to keep in mind. How close are you to the sidewalk? And again, I just wanted to share that there are resources available to help you figure out where you can plant and how close to curbs and things like that you need to be. This is just one image from the City of Tacoma's website. If you look up City of Tacoma urban forestry, you'll find a lot of resources about the regulations related to planting trees, and that will also go out in your email. And so really you're just looking for where is there anything that's in the way. And again, you want to be kind of noting what's going to be shaded by this too. If I put the tree in, if I plant the tree in this spot, how will that interact with the space around it? How will the shade interact? And that might be where you start going, ooh, this is going to be nice. Because that's what I think. And just one more thing, there's lots of other things to consider here, driveways, gas shutoff valves. These are things, fire hydrants, things you can see in the landscape. You don't need any special tools to notice that. And there are kind of guidelines for how far away you need to be from those. And this is, again, I put the link on the top here, the City of Tacoma's website. Quickly, I want to talk about how to understand utilities because we get a lot of questions about that. And then we'll dig into the tree planting. So not the fanciest thing here, but there are kind of two ways, or well, three ways, I guess, technically, to look at utilities. You can use these DART maps, the DART map that the City of Tacoma has created, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. And you also need to call before you dig. It's Washington 811 or callbeforeyoudig.org. Both of them are free. They're really easy. I mean, permits aren't always as easy as this, but I've always had good luck with the utilities. It's free. They come out very quickly and mark the utilities. And this is what the DART map looks like. You can see some utilities running here, and it just gives you a sense. Oh, like I might expect to have something marked out here when the utility company, excuse me, comes by. And this is what that page on the 811, oh sorry, callbeforeyoudig.org looks like. And you can get the phone number from there, or you can do it right online. And when you do that, usually you just put in your address, a note about why you need them to mark it. So you say, like, we'd like to plant a tree, and you might describe the address, the location of where you want to put the tree. Ideally, you even mark the tree out with a flag or some white marking paint. Also, we get a lot of questions about what do these different things mean. When the utility companies come out, they don't say, they don't draw a line that says this is water. Oh, well, sometimes they do, but usually it's just a line in paint. But if you go to the Call Before You Dig website, you can see this APWA color code. It's the same, it's kind of a universal color code, and you'll know what the different things mean. And you're always welcome to reach out to us too, and when we can, we'll try to get back to you. Now I wanted to get into types of plant material. So this is when we start really getting into tree planting. There are actually a number of different kinds of plant material out there. They have different pros and cons. They're used in different settings, and they're handled in different ways. The ones we'll look at today are bare root trees, which is basically what you're seeing in this picture. The tree is transported without any soil attached. Often this is something that's done with seedlings or fruit trees or street trees during a certain time of year. Normally they are dug and then kind of immediately sent out, or sometimes they're dug in November, put in a freezer or a cool storage, I should say, and then sent in February to their destination and planted out kind of right away. But we'll get into that some more. Also, container trees. Trees can be grown in all sorts of sizes of containers. And then root control bags and root control containers, which is a kind of a specialty. And then balled and burlap trees, which is what you see in larger kind of institutional plantings at parks. Often you'll see it at parks or schools or developed projects. I just wanted to kind of put in a note for just realizing that when trees are dug, or whether they're dug as bare root or dug and put in balled and burlapped containers, it is really stressful for the tree. So there's often some, and this is why you can kind of see that often some of the roots are cut away in order to make that, that root ball small and manageable and easy to wrap in burlap. And that does cause some stress for the trees. So there's kind of with that stress is some potential loss in trees. Definitely you can see some loss in the leaf, in the canopy at the top of the tree, or sometimes you'll see dieback in the branches. And also just knowing that we don't want trees just sitting around any longer than necessary. The sooner they get in the ground, the happier they are, the more successful they will be. Okay, so bare root trees. These are some larger bare root trees used for street tree plantings. The one you see on the left has been dipped in hydrogel, and that's one thing that is used to make it so that volunteer projects can use big bare root trees and have the roots survive. And usually it'll get wrapped in plastic, dipped in hydrogel, wrapped in plastic, and then moved around that way, and then planted pretty quickly. I mean, it's like you have about a 2-week window when you have the hydrogel, but really you need to go quickly with that. It does need to be watered a lot, especially right after planting, because as you can imagine, it's just like it's very close to drying out. All these roots are kind of slowly closing up, or not slowly, quickly trying to slow down the loss of water, and so they're kind of closing up, and in that causes some desiccation and drying out. One thing that's challenging about this type of plant material for a lot of volunteers is that it's hard to figure out where to do the planting, how deep to plant the tree. And I actually don't have great images for that. I'm realizing a little gap here, but the root collar is kind of like right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I'm hoping you can. But if you, let's see if I have a good, do I have it? Oh, I think I can draw. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I can use a laser pointer. Oh, wow. Okay. So here is the root collar in this area right here. Actually, it's right here. You can see this point where it kind of, it gets wider, and then all of a sudden it gets a little bit narrower. If you were looking at this plant material up close, you would see that the texture of the bark is actually different where the root collar is and below the root collar versus above the bark. And that's really relevant because the area below the root collar is adapted to being underground, which means that it's probably in contact with moisture quite a bit of the time, whereas the stem, this bark on the stem, is really adapted to being out in the open air. It tends to be drier in the air than it is in the soil, so you kind of see how that goes and why it matters. When you plant trees too deep, that's when you're definitely likely to see some loss there. Because what you find is that at the base of the tree, the part that's underground, if you plant too deep, that part starts to rot more quickly, and that can cause some damage, some decline in the trees, and eventual mortality. But these trees are really inexpensive, so that's kind of handy. I mean, relatively speaking, that is really handy when you're trying to do large volunteer events or large projects where you want to get a lot of trees out, and they're also very light, so it's easy to carry. And it's one of the things about larger plant material is that it can be very hard on the back, on your back. So here are some containers. I'm sorry, I'm realizing these pictures aren't that great, but you see there are some containers. They're relatively large. I think these were number 7s, and it's easier to get the planting depth because you can often follow the planting depth to some degree in the containers, realizing that there's usually some mulch that has been put on top. So you may find that actually the planting, that root collar, if you look around for the root collar, might actually be as much as a knuckle or two down below the top of the soil. But you get a little bit closer there. Problem with that is that you might find some girdling happens with the roots. Sometimes the containers cause the roots to just sort of circle around the outside of the container, and that is also one of those things that causes some decline in the trees and potentially could kill the tree. And I feel like I keep mentioning that, but one of the things that's really important about planting is that when you plant a tree well and you water it consistently and carefully afterwards, then you're more likely to have a successful tree and then that tree grows and becomes independent, and if it's a big tree, it'll provide shade. If it's a small tree, maybe it's providing flowers or beauty of some sort, and that's what we're really looking for. We don't want to plant trees over and over again, have them die after a year or two. The other thing that's important to note with the containers, which is very handy, is that they are less vulnerable to drying out, and that is often a real advantage when you may or may not be able to plant a whole lot of trees in 1 or 2 days. Another thing I wanted to mention is root control bags. These are a little less common, but we do use them in Tacoma, and they're interesting because they are basically containers, but because they have this kind of fabric material, it causes something called air pruning, and you don't see the girdling roots that happen with that can happen with a container. The roots start going out, and then when they hit the air, they die off. And then sometimes you can pull the bag off the root ball, but sometimes you have to actually cut it off. But that's a great plant material to work with. The other one that also is not very common and is generally proprietary is air pruning containers. These are 2 examples. There are a few out there on the market. What it basically works in a similar way. The roots start going out, and when they hit the air, the tips die off, and so you get a lot of root growth in the root ball without the girdling roots, and that's a really great thing. I think I'll kind of leave it at there. You have the benefit of being able to water it like a container. You have a little bit more, they're a little easier to handle. You have a little more time before you have to plant, but you don't have the girdling roots. Another one is balled and burlapped trees. We don't use those quite as much at Tacoma Tree Foundation because they tend to be used for larger plant material, and they can be difficult to handle with 2 or 3 people. It really works best to have a cart that is specially designed for moving balled and burlap trees around, or even sometimes heavy equipment is used for them. You saw the image already of what happens when a tree is, well, sometimes balled and burlapped is used, just a tree is dug and then the burlap is put over it in whatever shape makes sense. But commercial industry will generally cut it in a uniform pattern like what you see in the photograph, put the fabric around it, and take it out. One benefit is that all of that whole bunch of soil comes out with the tree. The roots are protected the whole time. They stay in that. They generally do pretty well in the first year. You don't have to worry so much about drying out and that sort of thing. When you start really having to watch them is after a couple years, 2 or 3 years. That's when you need to keep watering them and making sure they're doing well. Okay, there's a term used in community forestry and landscape architecture and landscape design a lot called right tree, right place. I think it's one of those things that, right tree, right place, sort of like you want the right tree in the right place, but it's actually a very nuanced thing, and we don't have time to get into all the nuance of it, but I just wanted to throw a few things out there, which is that when you see a tree in a nursery or you pick one up at a plant share, plant giveaway, it might be small and look really cute and seem like it would be perfect in a certain spot. And then you find out actually that is a much bigger tree, and now you have to contend with, well, did I pick the right spot, and is it going to be okay when it gets older? And there are some resources out there, which I'll share at the end, for how you can learn a little bit more about the trees that maybe you picked, and whether or not it's in the right spot, whether you have the right spot for it, and what it's going to look like kind of in the future. And some of the things to keep in mind are really like, how big is the tree going to be? What is the species or the cultivar most likely to grow to be? And then how fast does it get to that point? Some trees grow really slowly, and so you want to kind of match that time scale with your expectations. Whereas some trees go really fast, and that little tiny tree you have in 2 years is very tall. You just want to be kind of aware of the, empowering yourself with knowledge so you can make a good decision. A couple other things to consider is the tree evergreen or is it a deciduous tree? And so that becomes really important because it changes the way that air moves around, the way the house, if it's a house, shaded, whether or not leaves are dropping or needles are dropping or when they might be doing these kinds of things. Evergreen trees can be so nice. They're really not used as much as they could be, and they are like pretty much part of our native landscape here, as I'm sure you all know. So just being aware, it's not like there's not always a right choice. I mean, I think that's that right tree, right place. It makes it seem like there's a right choice, but there isn't necessarily a right choice. It's more that there are choices that are problematic later, and the more you know ahead of time, the more you can avoid the sort of problematic situations, which is power lines are a big one. And often, I see this quite often, and it's very easy to have this happen. You put a nice, perfect sized tree with a good shape underneath a power line, thinking it's going to be fine, and then 5-10 years later, it's interacting with the power line, and then that becomes a problem for multiple reasons, and the tree might get topped or cut or something like that. And we really want to avoid those kinds of situations by picking trees that are going to be fine underneath the power line. Similar things happen with sidewalks, and some trees are just more likely to cause problems with sidewalks if they're too close, and others aren't as big of a concern. So it's just really, maybe we'll do a webinar just on that topic, how to make decisions about the trees and how to pick the right tree for the right place. But I just want to introduce that idea as something to consider to make sure that you avoid planting trees in problematic spots. But now we'll get into like actually planting the tree in the ground, as I know that's what everybody probably came here for. So some of the rules of thumb here is that you dig a hole 2 or 3 times wider than the root ball. That's pretty much what lots of people say. It's it's best practices, and the rototill 5 times actually is not necessary in a lot of situations. It's really in very compacted situations that you want to be thinking about that. And really the point of making the hole bigger, 2 to 3 times bigger, is that when you take the burlap off or take it out of the container, and we'll get into this a little more, you want to be teasing the roots away. And if the hole is big enough, you can direct the roots to go out away from the tree in this really healthy way. And you can tamp the soil down around the roots gently so that it doesn't compact the soil, but creates this great foundation for the tree to get started. When you have a really small hole and you plop it straight down, you may actually contribute to the girdling. The tree might, the roots might start kind of growing in a circular pattern, and it actually can be more difficult to work with, really. So I wanted to show you a little bit about why we tease the roots away. These are 2 examples of trees that have some kind of odd root patterns happening here. If you saw a plant growing that had come from seed in its spot and you took it out, you would see a very different pattern than either of these, generally speaking. So the one on the right that the laser pointer pointed at, you can see that there's, well, you may not be able to see, I will tell you that there are some roots growing up towards the top of the tree. Now this happened probably because it was in a container and it stayed in that container too long, and so the roots just started growing wherever they could. And that meant in this case that it grew down and back around. And if you were to take that plant just as it is and then either plop it in the ground or put it in a larger container, these roots would not move to accommodate for the space. They wouldn't, these older roots would not be like, oh yeah, oh, there's so much space now, I'm going to spread out. They would stay here, like just as they are. And as the tree grows, those roots would grow, and they would potentially get in the way of each other and interrupt the ability of the plant to move nutrients and water around, which is, you know, absolutely critical for the plant to be able to make that exchange. But we can do something about that. We can pull those roots away from the base of the tree, and then if our hole is big enough, 2 to 3 times the size of that root ball, we can pull them out into the different directions and then start putting the soil back down. Now, what you see on the left-hand side here, and it's not quite as clear, I think, but you see this root, if you follow the laser pointer to the left, you'll see this root is wrapping around, and if we were to follow it, we would find that that root is wrapping all the way around the tree. And before it's sort of degraded over time, but before you could see like lots of girdling roots here. And if that tree again was planted in the ground, it would not live very long before those roots would interfere with the tree's ability to move water and nutrients around. So another thing I wanted to sort of show you here is that there's quite a bit of variety, for one thing, in the way that trees respond to conditions, and even two trees that come from the same nursery or the same environment can end up having just slightly different paths, and those paths make a difference. What you see here on the right-hand side is really healthy root mass of a tree that was planted as a seedling. Looks really good and nice spread out, lots of fibrous roots. And you can see the top of the tree here looks pretty good too. This is a Douglas fir, a pretty healthy looking top. Is grown quite a bit. They were planted at the same time, so you can see that one is quite a bit smaller, and you can see there's some kind of odd growth happening here that's short needles, lots of needles, short needles. It's generally a sign of stress when it comes to Douglas fir, one of the signs of stress, and you can see there's parts of it that just don't even have any needles. And then what I really wanted to direct your attention to is this kind of J shape here on the root. That happens sometimes with seedlings in particular, and when it's young like this, I think you can kind of correct it. I'm challenging myself a little bit on that, but if you see it, you can at least encourage the roots, can bring these roots over here, encourage them over to the opposite side so that you're getting a little bit more movement, and hopefully over time the tree will correct and that J root will disappear. But it's something you want to kind of keep a lookout for. You don't want to actually plant the tree deeper than the base of the container or whatever it is you're working with. So it's actually good to have a little bit of a solid base there at the bottom. Most tree roots actually go out away from the center point of the tree. There's some images where you see these roots that make this, that all go really deep and out like the top of the tree, but it's really more that they go out horizontal. For the most part, you'll get like some roots that are going down, but when we have these younger trees, we really want to encourage that movement horizontally. And then you want to, like I said, make the hole 2 or 3 times wider. So 2 or 3 times wider, but not deeper. And then add soil around the roots and gently tamp it. So there's this just a little bit of gentle nuance here of tamping the soil down enough that you're getting good contact between the soil and the roots, but not so much that you're eliminating the air in the soil. When you lose that air in the soil, then that's where you get into compaction. And again, we start interrupting the plant's ability to get water and nutrients and make these exchanges that are really important. And then you want to water. So I can't overemphasize that, especially around here. Water first 3 summers, multiple times a week. And that's where we are now. So After you've done this, you've planted the tree. I didn't mention mulch, actually. Mulch can be a really nice thing, especially if it's not touching the bark, making a nice ring of mulch. And it gets back to the water a little here, that mulch actually can hold moisture and make it so that the evaporation of water out of the soil doesn't happen quite so quickly, so those roots can stay a little moisture for more of the summer. But you really want to be planting, so you really want to be watering about 15 gallons a week, sometimes more. But sometimes it's like, especially here in Tacoma, it can be cloudy, it's humid out, so maybe the trees are fine. But if you just planted the tree, it needs like water, it needs a good soaking, and that's where you get to that 15 gallons. And if you don't have a good way of measuring that, we do have some buckets, thanks to TPU, that we can share with you that help make it easier. They have little holes in the bottom, and you fill them up 3 times a week, and you're in great shape. I have some resources here to share with you, kind of more about the plants and the plants to pick for different settings, as that often is the tricky part. And then we'll get into questions here. What are the green bags on the trees in Tacoma? Are they water bags? Do trees have to have that? So a good question, and I probably should have put a picture on that, so maybe I'll do that next time. So those are called gator bags, and they are for watering trees. They hold 15 gallons of water. So they're a nice way to fill them up, and it slowly releases the water over time, over the course of a few days or a week, and then you can go back, fill it up again one time. You can put the hose in at a high volume and fill it up rather quickly, and then kind of walk away for a week and come back. They work great. They're a little expensive. If you participate in Grit City Trees, you're likely to get a gator bag. But if you don't have a gator bag, you can use these buckets. As I mentioned, you can reach out to us and we can share it with you. They have little holes in the bottom, and like I said, they're 5 gallons, so you can fill them up, let the water go down, fill them up a day or two later, and kind of go on like that. And you can use your hose at a low volume to do the same thing. I think it's just that, especially if you're not in the habit of watering trees regularly, it can seem like you're putting more water on trees when you just have the hose open and you're just spraying it, and things like, oh, that's a lot of water. And it might even start running off, and you're like, oh, it's running off, it must be enough. The bucket or the gator bag, they really help just make you realize, like, oh, it needs a lot of water. The trick is to keep doing it, and I think that's sometimes what happens with gator bags or buckets or anything like that, is we do it a few times and then kind of forget that you need to go back and fill it up again. And or was it last week or the week before? When was the last time I did that? I don't know. Should we stake or should we not stake? And it's another one of those, it depends. It depends on where you're at, how much wind or interference there's going to be, and like how big the tree is versus the size of the root ball. If you have a smaller plant, you're probably in good shape just planting it. Ideally, the tree is interacting with the wind, and that helps stimulate the roots to grow and create that structure that helps the tree get bigger and more stable over time. However, there are some parts of the city that get a lot of wind, really heavy wind, and trees, in that case, that were just planted will fall right over, and that has happened. Not hurting anyone, but because they're still young, but it's amazing how much the wind can really move the plant. And in that case, it's better to be prepared to get the stakes, to put them in the ground, and make sure that the tree is supported for the first year. And then you take the stakes off and you let the wind help create that stability in the roots. And I think that's it. Thank you all for participating.